Hi, everyone. This is Susan Regan, and I am here with Chandler Hoffman, and we are having another series of demystifying divorce. So, as you know, I am a mediator and a therapist, a seasoned family therapist in the Bay Area with offices in Berkeley and San Francisco. So, I've been working in the Bay Area and lucky to work with a lot of great professionals here, and one of them is Chandler Hoffman. Chandler, I'm so happy that you came on this talk with me. I really want people to know how you work and how we collaborate together.
Great. Thank
So,
you so much for having me, Susan.
can you tell us a little bit about what you do and what your focus is?
Sure. Yeah, let me introduce myself a little bit. I'm a psychologist, and I'm Chandler Hoffman, and I was licensed in 2000, and I was working for the court system for 15 years. So I spent the majority of my career, about 15 years, the first part of it, in the Superior Court doing, well, recommending mediation specifically, and now it's called child custody recommending counseling. It changed in the legislature a couple years ago just to be more clear about the role. Essentially, we mostly did parenting plans for families coming through the court system who needed parenting plans. The state of California, in its wisdom, thought it was important that all families get some kind of mediation prior to going to court to allow them to have self-determination for their children and their parenting plans. And so I essentially spent, every day doing parenting plans for parents coming through the court system. And our goal was always to help them reach agreements, but we were a recommending county. Different counties have different formats, but Alameda County had a recommending county where if families were not able or parents were not able to come to agreements, we made recommendations about child custody. Well, that led to the kind of work that I've continued to do after I left the courts, which is specifically around child custody issues, sometimes very contested issues, but as a mediator, I'm always very passionate about helping people with self-determination. So essentially, I do a lot of the same things that you do. I do mediation around child custody issues. I also do divorce mediation in general. I work with a team of, I work with other attorneys and financial professionals in collaborative divorce. I still do some court-related work. I am a parent coordinator, so I make some decisions for folks, and I'm a private recommending child custody counselor for that kind of work. So I always find that, I'm very passionate about this work, but it comes from my career in the court system of working with thousands of families and interviewing thousands of children, and I just have a real passion for it.
Great. I love to hear your background, and I love the idea about helping parents create a parenting plan. So I think we're going to talk a little bit about like what the differences of services are, why people use professionals. But so I'm going to get back to you on like just the importance of the parenting plan, because I think sometimes people don't understand like why some of these court and legal formats are really important just to create structure in your new family system. Let's talk about why people use professionals. Like I know both you and I have talked before, and we really agree on the fact that we want to empower people to get whatever kind of support they need, but not to stay dependent on professionals if they don't have to, if they're just trying to get through like the first phase of separating their families. But some people really need to stay in touch with professionals throughout the process because it is something that's highly conflictual. So why do you feel like people use professionals and might use professionals for a long time? Like, what are some of the reasons you see?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. One of the things that happened to me when I was thinking about leaving the court system was really wondering about what the differences between the court system is and the private practice sort of arena. And what I realized is coming through the court system is that every family seemingly needed kind of the same thing. They needed somebody to help them. They needed professionals to guide the conversation. They needed facilitation, and they needed some expertise around child custody issues and child development issues, communication issues, and relationship building kinds of skills. And the court systems, truthfully, are not built to do that kind of work. And in fact, that's why I felt like, they hired psychologists and mental health people. But when I was looking to build my private practice, I tried to think about what most families needed. And in fact, they all seemingly needed the same kinds of professional advice, but also support. They needed someone to guide the conversation, to know what was important to talk about, specifically in parenting plans, custody issues, or the detail of parenting plans, and we can talk more about it later, but how important those details are so that you avoid conflict. Of course, one of the things that I bring from my study of child custody issues is that conflict itself is probably the most important thing to keep track of and to reduce in general. Those skills to reduce conflict are critical for children's well-being. They're truthfully critical for all of our well-being. We can't function very well under lots of conflict for too long. So decreasing conflict is one of the key factors of why professionals can really help people specifically build parenting plans, but also within a co-parenting context, because what we know from the research is that high conflict puts children at risk. As we decrease conflict, children's risk factors go way down.
Right. And there's always that nerve-wracking time when people are deciding to divorce, that the conflict has been pretty high between them prior to that. And then there's a real sense of like increased conflict around the transition.
Yes.
And that's why I feel like it's great to have professionals holding the family steady during that time. But if the conflict continues after the separation, it's almost like nothing was resolved, right? As if the kids are still living in that same level of a conflict. That's when I think that professionals need to stay involved, because something needs to be still adjusted between those two parents in order to give those kids a fair shot at not living in a high stress situation. And sometimes that means like different kinds of parenting models, co-parenting models, like parallel parenting, where parents aren't really touching base with each other, but sometimes they're touching base with the professional between them.
Yes.
And that can be really helpful, because it's like, okay, we can't seem to co-parent together and be in collaborative parenting model, but we could continue to parent our kids really well and not be really stressed with them or show them our stress if we go into a parallel parenting model.
Yeah.
Have you seen that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to mention one more thing. Conflict comes in many different forms. And one of the ways that is more subtle that people don't always realize is that unresolved conflict can be actually just as dangerous as higher conflict. And what I mean by that is that, children are very good, especially at different ages, of picking up their parents' attitudes about the other parent or about, their stress levels. And unresolved conflict between parents and co-parents has a sort of it's insidious in a way, because children are always picking up parents' attitudes about the other parent. And if there's a lot of unresolved conflict, not just higher conflict or outspoken conflict, children have a hard time with that as well. So I always say that it's conflict that is really important to address, but also even if people don't say anything, the unresolved conflict can be just as dangerous.
Right. And I always say that to parents too, is like, how is the conflict still alive? And kids know their parents so well. They know their tones, their body language, their expression. So you may think that you're not saying anything negative about the parent, but you might be acting very negative about the parent in front of the child and even in community. So the child gets a sense of what other people in the community might think about their parent. So I feel like that's also how conflict keeps going, right, in the system. And that kids need to be free of that in some way. And sometimes I tell my parents, like, it's about almost at times doing an Academy Award performance until you can stick it and actually be more detached from that parent, which might happen if you get away from them for a little bit, if you do your own work around what the unresolved feelings about the ending relationship were for that other parent.
Yeah, I think faking it till you make it is absolutely an important step in helping your children. And at some point, if you can, it's more of an aspirational goal, but I do believe that having, the acceptance of where you are and the acceptance of the relationship and actually making steps to try to make the relationship or the communication better can really be the work that is actually really important when professionals are helping you. Because of course you'll get more, it's easier to do that kind of work when you're getting help and direction around it. And you're having a space to have the difficult conversations that might go awry if you had them on your own. And so again, I think facilitation is one of the most important factors of getting professional help from my perspective, is having someone who is a neutral as much as possible to really guide the conversation and help sort of not necessarily referee all the time, because some people are really good at refereeing themselves, but sometimes that's necessary. It's just sort of, again, have someone just listen to someone for a second, and even just that intervention can make a big difference in the conversation and resolving conflict or talking about the difficult things that one must talk about in co-parenting specifically.
Right, right. So I hear you. And I think the difference of how I work is I work in the co-parenting mediation realm with people too, but I also help people do some of the healing behind the scenes, not necessarily the same client. Like I wouldn't see a client in a co-parenting mediation situation and have them in my groups, but people in my groups who have kids are also working on what I call it is stage 6. Like there's the 5 grief stages that people go through.
Yes.
And sometimes they stay stuck in one of them, right? And sometimes we see it as anger. People most of the time come to some kind of legal system or professional help when they're in anger, because anger is like this action feeling.
Yes, it is.
But then I also see people really working in my groups in what I call stage 6. So we have the 5 grief stages, right? We have denial, sadness, depression, anger, bargaining, and acceptance. But then there's stage 6, which is being accountable to your part of why the relationship didn't work. And sometimes that means if you were in an abusive relationship, staying too long, right?
Right, sure.
And the other is how to work on the part of your personality that might be the hard part to manage, or the part that does relationships in an unhealthy way. So I see, like, if people are going to do behind the scenes work, they have work to do as the co-parents, right? But they also have their own work to do, which really shows up a lot. I know in my families, even if one of the people works on themselves, they start having a different positioning with that partner and really starting to focus back on their lives, which shifts the whole system.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. You know, the individual work, and I do a lot of that individual work with folks too. People ask me all the time, can you do co-parenting with one person? And I actually really believe, just to your point, that the individual work can really affect the system of co-parenting. If someone is working on the acceptance or the stage 6 that you talk about and really taking their part, they can come to the relationship and the communication very differently. And of course, in systems theory, we might even say that if we change one part of the system, the whole system changes. So I utilize that aspect a lot in my work. So I would agree with you.
Right. And then if the child is, like, let's say we bring it back to the idea about the child and how the conflict is continued, right? So if that one parent is getting some help and they're actually disengaging from the old system and creating a new system, even if they're hearing negativity from the child about the other parent, they can actually address it really differently. So they don't buy into it, and it actually ceases the conflict, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Or ceases the negative reflection that they're getting about themselves. And that can really, I've seen that switch over and over again.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think individually people can do a lot to really move through those 5 stages of grief, to become a different kind of person in that relationship, and to, have a strategic partnership with this person, even if it's somebody you continue to not like or to be angry at or to have problems with. Your own issues or your own way of approaching the co-parenting relationship, I think has a lot to do with how well your children do and how well you do.
Right, which kind of leads to that question that I get a lot on the phone or in the first session is, I don't want to get separated because I don't want to damage my child or my kids.
Sure.
And I think, well, what is more damaging is to stay in a situation that's highly conflictual and that's not changing, right? So sometimes I feel like I'm also probably like you on both ends of the spectrum. I'm helping people figure out how to separate, but I'm also helping people stay together. And it's pretty common that I might sit with a couple for a while and say, okay, let's turn every stone. Can we change this relationship so that it can be healthy enough to continue to raise your kids together and have a family together? And so, I do advocate for people to try to work on their relationships if they can, right? And sometimes people are done. They just have come in and they're done, or one person is not going to do the work. Right. So then there is really going into acceptance about really moving to the next phase, and maybe pacing it a little slowly so that people can process why we're going there. And sometimes there's not that luxury. People are really, one person might be really moving quickly, and there's always that navigation of how to hold people that are in really different emotional spaces.
Yes, and I think that happens even with people who have, if one person has already decided, or both people have decided that this relationship, they can't stay in it. They're certainly in different emotional places, and I think one of the things about having a professional assess the situation and help and facilitate is that that's really something that I think about a lot, is what one person needs is not the same thing that the other person needs. And sometimes it's important to be able to, again, do that individual work to help people meet them where they are a little bit, and also to help the other partner understand that there are differences in their emotional processes. And again, I always say that it's a strategic partnership, co-parenting. Mm-hmm. And business people appreciate this kind of sort of nomenclature or words, because they understand the business relationship. They understand how it is to become and to be successful in business relationships. And many of those business relationship sort of techniques are really applicable to the co-parent relationship. And so I do and many people see the co-parenting relationship as what's called a kind of a business relationship. And of course, it can be a very good business relationship with a lot of love and care and kindness and openness. And it can be, somewhat stale, but it can also, have a lot of rules and boundaries that helps people function and come to the relationship in high functioning ways.
Right. And it's a really good marker, like to treat that person as you would your colleague.
Yes.
Right. That's a really good way of like growing the relationship up to another level.
Yes.
Instead of intimate level to much more formal level of engaging. Yeah.
I always say, I have sort of a thought about how people really change their relationship or their status. It's not just the status, it's really about how you function in the relationship. And one of the ways that I sort of see the co-parenting relationship is that at some point people have to end their intimate relationship in some way and actually create something very unique and very different. Of course, there are carryovers, and some people struggle with the carryovers, but really, essentially, it's a unique new relationship that has a lot of different expectations, and people have to relearn how to be in relationships. And I think that's one of the ways professionals can really help people navigate the after divorce and separation.
Sometimes when I'm seeing a client or two parents who are trying to divorce, and I'm seeing them from the very beginning, and they're trying to figure out and strategize about their separation, which is like the ideal parents, right? They come in, they're making a plan to do it. Not everybody does that. Some people come in crisis because they need to do it quickly, and so there's a lot more intensity to it.
Yes.
But for the folks who are planning, and I'm strategizing, like you said, I'm strategizing with how to help them and to see how much they can go into more of that business relationship.
Yes.
But there's oftentimes, and I like people to know that it's not a failure, but sometimes people can only get to a certain point with a professional, and then it doesn't work. And so I always think about this, like I always say to my clients, well, I got you through this chapter, right, and we learned a lot about what you need now. So I think that's a good lead into like all the different kinds of services that you can get.
Okay.
So we talked about basically three. There's co-parent therapy, there's mediation, there is also the PCC role.
Yeah.
The parent-child coordinator. Can you talk about those and how you see them?
Sure. It really starts, I think, with mediation from a sort of continuation or continuum basis. Mediation is really the basic idea that a neutral party will help people gather the information. And from a child custody's perspective, and what I specifically did in the court system, which I continue to do, is to build a parenting plan. And that the goal is that mediation is really about a project of gathering information and coming to agreements and creating a document, truthfully, that has those agreements as a part of it. That really helps people function post-divorce or post-separation, or with the idea that they will be taking care of a child together. So again, specifically mediation around child custody issues. This obviously can go into other realms, other disputes specifically, certainly, neighbors or or the other issues, the legal issues and the financial issues around divorces specifically. But let's talk specifically about just child custody mediation. I mean, the idea from my perspective, mediation is really about a series of conversations that results in as many agreements as possible, and really about conversations that they need to have so that they can actually come to agreements that have detail to how they will care for children together or separately. And there's lots of rules and boundaries, and the idea is having a series of conversations. What coming down the line of the continuum a little bit is more of the co-parenting therapy or co-parenting counseling. A lot of courts still make a lot of referrals for co-parenting counselors because, well, truthfully, they see a lot of returning parents who are continuing to argue over details of the parenting plan. And one of the issues is, and as you say, one of my goals is always to work myself out of a job in a lot of ways, is to help people have as much investment in their relationship and communication. And by the way, you know, again, the reason I left the courts is because the courts are truthfully, well, they're organized by administrators and lawyers and judges who have no background in communication training or understanding developmental periods of children, or even understand relationship building issues. That is the area of mental health people. And I really focus on that particular issue or those kinds of issues when I'm working with people. You know, you can, it's not, the details are very important in mediation. So the more details, the better in a lot of ways. Co-parenting counseling is really about the ongoing ways in which people take care of children, the ongoing way in which people relate to each other, and how they affect their children in different ways. There are different models to utilize for co-parenting counseling. I really use a model of communication, improving communication and improving relationship, such that I really feel like people, again, can work themselves out of using professionals and into a space that they can be very productive and as much as possible have an aspirational relationship. So I start with goals, and I really try to encourage people to reach those goals within the therapeutic process that they have. Again, co-parenting therapy, I see it as less about the making agreements and creating a parenting plan, and more about the discussions that are always needed to have ongoing collaboration. And again, sometimes co-parents don't have a lot of collaboration based on either their personality or the long-standing issues that continue to come up. So sometimes we choose different formats to help them organize their co-parenting relationship. So again, another continuum might be a very collaborative co-parenting group. And then the other end of that spectrum would be a very parallel parenting kind of relationship, something you talked about before. So we might even sort of typify them or ask them to, or really choose the kind of model that they will use. I always say co-parenting in general you need the skill sets for very collaborative co-parents, and you also need real boundaries for, in the idea of having a parallel parenting. So I always believe co-parents can utilize the different skills along the continuum, and they can choose the different kind of techniques they need, either at different times in their lives or with different discussions.
Yeah, so let me pull a few things out that you said that I think are really important. One of the things that we both know is a big reason why people separate is because they have different parenting styles. Yes. And parenting conflict can really separate a couple, because some of these are non-negotiable value kind of differences. So that's one thing, is the parent conflict. I love that you're talking about your model of work is through communication, because oftentimes I'm looking at a court order or a mediation or a parent settlement agreement, and people really have a different interpretation about what the parenting plan means and what different parameters actually mean and how to implement them. So I feel like I switch from the mediation part, which is making the agreements and getting them in a document, yeah, to actually having discussion in a co-parenting way of what's going to be unique. How is these parents going to, in their own homes, uniquely parent these kids, even though they have very different parenting styles? And then how are we going to document that? Yes. And then as kids grow and change, different parenting is needed and different schedules are needed. Kids want to do different things. They can stay away from, they can be away from parents for longer periods of time. So there's longer vacations. Sometimes you might see like more of a 7-7 schedule kind of growing into that in a family system. But so I really hear that. I hear the idea about the details in the parenting plan, the document that is provided when you do a mediation piece, and then the co-parenting piece is really working on the parenting theory. How are you going to raise your kids together, even if you're really different in terms of your parenting styles?
And I would also say, you know, there's as much detail, and you can come to a very detailed parenting plan. All parents, you know, are really encouraged to do as much detail as possible. But there's never, you know, there's never enough detail that will define everyone's life or a child or situations that parents will come into. So it's really important to have ongoing discussions and to be able to have those ongoing discussions with either less conflict or resolving the conflicts that are sort of ongoing. And I think I really see co-parenting therapy as a more of an ongoing work to really help people have the difficult discussions that cannot be covered all the time by an agreement in a document or in a parenting plan. So it's really
right. These are in-depth discussions.
Yeah,
in-depth discussions, and I always find them really strategic. Like I love to meet my parents and have regular meetings with them before the fiscal year starts, before the school year starts, so that we really get a rough draft of like, what is this year going to look like? And what are the predictable changes that are going to happen in the family? Some people are moving, getting different jobs, getting into new relationships, getting married again. So that I see this sort of continuum of people really changing in their lives and needing a place to talk about it. Sometimes there's one of the children get along with one parent more than the other and want to live with that parent more and have more visitation with the other. So there's lots of different things that need to be talked about.
absolutely.
And then there's this thing that happens is that no matter how much you talk about it, people will not agree.
Right.
So sometimes we do not come into agreement in a co-parenting session or in a mediation session, which I think leads to like, what is the parent-child coordinator?
Yeah. So this is a role that, you know, I think it exists actually more over in the country. We used to call it something called special mastering in California. And we're taking on a much more consistent nomenclature at this point. Most states in the United States use a parent coordinator as this role. And this is a quasi-judicial role, very distinct from the from the mediator, even the recommending mediator, and distinct from a co-parenting counselor. It's someone who has the expertise to make child custody related decisions, somewhat like a judge in a courtroom, but they're outside of the courtroom and much in the private setting. So it is generally, I think in the state of California, judges cannot actually order this over the objections of the parties themselves. So parties do have to stipulate and agree to utilize this sort of quasi-judicial officer outside of the courtroom. The advantages of it are that I always call it like the Swiss Army knife of parenting, of custody sort of professionals, because they can be given a lot of authority to make decisions specifically about a lot of the custody related decisions. There is a general practice that custody itself is reserved for the superior court. And so that usually people come into the parent coordination role or use a parent coordinator after they've done an extensive either custody evaluation or they've really decided all the custody issues through the court system. But now they're at a point where they are having a hard time making the daily decisions. Their conflict is either so high, or there's lots of unresolved conflict, or their parenting styles are so different and their values are so different and the goals might be different, that they run into a lot of problems making really just daily decisions. Things like, you know, what to put in a child's lunchbox. One person might really be offended by what one parent puts in a lunchbox, and the other, you know, might think that that's totally fine. Or how much, you know, naps, or you know, all kinds of different decisions that are really about the daily life of parenting, but that they just can't seem to, they either cause a lot of conflict, which again is the dangerous part, puts children at risk, or that they run into different issues specifically that they just can't make agreements about, and that they either return to court too often, and that the court is really not available to be on call for the daily decisions. And so what a parent coordinator does is really make those decisions for parents who can't make them for themselves. And it really is a decision-making model. One can utilize a lot of mediation in this role. One can utilize a lot of co-parenting counseling ways to approach, but generally it's much more designed to be a decision-making role and different than the co-parenting counseling, which is generally a confidential role and not a decision-making role, and truthfully different than the mediation, where you're trying to create the sort of beginnings of a parenting plan.
Right, right. So that means the parent-child coordinator would be the person that makes the decision. So then the parents, whether they like it or not, would accept that decision, and that decision becomes basically an enforceable court order.
That's correct. So parents come to the parent coordination stipulation to try to really, because they have had so much trouble making their own decisions by agreements. And one of the things, the concept is really sometimes any decision is better than no decision when people are in disagreement, especially for children, and especially when people can accept that an authority has made a decision. I always, I try to describe it even for the kids that come in, and I always want to introduce myself to the children who I'm working with, and when I'm a parent coordinator, and I tell them, I ask them if they play sports, and a lot of them do, and I say, there's always a referee in a sport that you play generally, and nobody pays a lot of attention to the referee, but and the referee is not sort of part of the team, but they're an important part. They make the decisions quickly, efficiently, and sometimes they don't always get it right. Some people can take issue with what a referee does, but it's an essential piece of creating a game that has fairness, that has organization, that has structure, and that continues to move on. And that this is kind of what I play, is I play the referee. I don't get a lot of fanfare, but it's an essential piece of the game.
Right. I think I love that, that you're the referee that's making the call so the family can move forward in the game of life, right? So that they can make decisions about haircuts, lunches, times that the kids go to bed, and that is something that both parents have to accept, and even the kids have to accept. It might not be the right decision for them either, but it is about moving forward, making decisions, moving forward, trying to function higher as a family than get stuck in conflict.
Yes.
Reasons for conflict to use a PCC. I think we understand that people might need to help trying to get their system deconstructed and reconstructed from being in a couple relationship to being in a different structure where there's two co-parents, possibly two different physical spaces where the children are being raised. But with a family that needs a parent-child coordinator, what kind of levels of conflict are you seeing?
Well, generally, you would say that most people who use a parent-child coordinator or a PC, a parent coordinator, generally have a lot of conflict or a lot of unresolved conflict. So those two things go together. It really has a lot to do with their inability, or either maybe even one person's inability to make decisions, or that somehow the interplay and the dynamics have been such that they have been caught in a lot of indecisions, and that they've tried and attempted to utilize different forms to make these decisions. They've tried by agreement, they've tried by negotiated settlement with their attorneys, they've tried going to court. Usually they end up in court more often than other people, and they need more direction. They need someone like a referee to be able to be available to them, to not only hear them, but to hear both sides and make a decision that's critical for the child.
Right. So I wonder also if you're seeing higher levels of mental health issues, addiction issues, and also domestic violence when using a PCC. Could you address those three frames of when you see there's like safety concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the main reasons that people do need decision makers, because the dynamics are such that they're either power dynamics or power differences that people really experience, abuse issues that people really experience, triggering that they have a hard time maintaining sort of a consistent sort of emotional well-being or approach to the kinds of conversations that people get triggered a lot, whether it's based on past trauma or trauma within the relationship. So absolutely, domestic violence and power dynamics come into play, and they're very common in more parent coordinator kinds of cases. Certainly personality disorders are very common, that one person comes with a very rigid kind of personality structure that might even make it much more difficult for them to agree to certain things or to accept certain things or to work with that certain person. Of course, all of this is a big soup. We don't always know what's going on all the time, but certainly personality disorders are very common in PC cases or parent coordination cases. And, I don't do a lot of diagnosing in my general practice, but there's certainly diagnosis to be considered when you're working on these kinds of cases. I get, when I'm a PC, I review all the different kinds of legal documentation, but I also review people's psychological documentation. So if they have a diagnosis, I want to work with those diagnoses and also work with do collateral contacts with the other professionals that have been helping them be as successful as possible. So certainly domestic violence, personality disorders, longstanding conflict, just even personality rigidity and triggering has a lot to do with the inability to make decisions.
And then we have our very last thing that we wanted to address, which you and I are seeing a lot more in our caseloads this year, I think. It's always been there, but I think it's more highlighted in terms of getting different kinds of services, and that is the parent alienation. So this is when usually a child or children don't want to see one of the parents. They've lost their relationship in this separation process, or while the parents were together raising them in the same household, they lost the connection. So when you're seeing this in your practice, what kinds of things do you do to help?
Well, this was called, the courts also do a lot of referring for this kind of case, and it's one of the cases that the court has the hardest time, I think, really dealing with, is that this is what we're calling sort of the resist and refuse dynamics from a child. Parent alienation is certainly, it has a lot of, there's a lot of people's opinions about what, parent alienation and how it comes to be. But we sort of try to use a more neutral stance now to say that there are resist and refuse dynamics in the relationship between a child and one parent. Mm-hmm. Certainly that's one of the most needed professional interventions, because it generally doesn't get better on its own. Many people will say, maybe if I just wait until after they're 18, it will generally get better. But my experience is that actually, there's a lot of issues involved in these kinds of cases. They're very complex, and they generally are systems oriented, meaning that everyone has had some experience that has led to this kind of dynamic. So the child has usually been offended in some way. The preferred parent, the parent that the child's very connected with, usually has some kind of attitude towards the other parent, and the parent that is being resisted usually has done something, at least in the child's mind, to deserve that this disconnection. So really, as a professional, you're trying to understand all of the different dynamics and all of the ways that the participants have participated in some way to create this dynamic. The one thing I know for sure that I've seen over and over is that just allowing it to be what it is never really addresses the issue. And avoidance of the relationship continues the avoidance of the relationship, really builds off each other. So having early intervention in these kinds of cases is paramount if they're going to work. We also have issues of developmental periods going on where children, especially, this happens a lot with teenagers. Yes. And of course, teenagers their developmental period is really about getting themselves ready to launch themselves. And so this can actually dovetail right into this kind of work, and it makes it much harder. So that's another factor to really be aware of at the same time. Right. So these are very complex cases. I do get a lot of referrals for them. They're very difficult in lots of ways, but they're very rewarding when everyone can start to sort of address their piece, and that a child's relationship can be salvaged with that parent.
Right. So I think sometimes I see them as doing a family therapy piece with the child and the alienated parent, and then also making sure that the other parent is in some kind of collaboration, talking about and softening their position of how they might be influencing that in some ways, even if it's very, very mild.
Yeah.
And then I also think of this idea about the therapeutic supervision piece, which is actually parents hiring someone to be there with them while they're visiting their child, so that their things can be normalized and sort of reinterpreted if it's interpreted in this kind of negative avoidant way by the child, or if the parent needs some parent coaching. So sometimes I see those two things helping: the family therapy model and the therapeutic supervision model.
Yeah.
Because if there's any relationship with the child, it will start coming through over time. Yeah. If there's any relationship with the child and the parent that's starting to develop again, it will come through over time. But I agree with you. It's avoidance leads to avoidance. Early prevention is better. And that it's challenging because there was some kind of offending, episode that happened that stuck in the child's mind at some developmental age.
Yep. And it's so important to have the opportunity to have these conversations again, early intervention as much as possible. But it's really important also that everybody in the system, even the preferred parent, this is one of the harder parts of these kinds of cases, is that the preferred parent doesn't really always realize their own contribution to the problem. And that can be, it's insidious. Sometimes they've never said anything bad about the other parent, but some of their attitudes have been this way, or they've subtly encouraged it. And my experience has said that if people can take some responsibility for being a part of the dynamic, that can go a long way. And that's one of the harder parts of these cases, is really talking to the preferred parent, because, well, the preferred parent has the relationship and sometimes wants to sort of, disconnect from the other parts of their child's relationship with their other parent. And that can be really difficult to bring them into the fold. But I find that that's a really critical piece of that process.
Right. That's a really, really good point. Well, I wanted to just summarize our talk, because we really talked about different kinds of professionals to use, different reasons why people have conflict, why people need to stay involved with professionals, what people might do to kind of do their own empowering co-parenting eventually, after they figure out how to develop a strategy with guidelines. And so this was really helpful, because I think we took it on a whole different bend than we had in the past in my past talks, really going more in depth about why it's important to document things and to change the relationship in a very concrete way.
Yeah,
so
I would agree.
So thanks so much for from all your contributions. You have a ton of knowledge, obviously a lot of experience, and I'm so glad to be working with you in the Bay Area. It's just a real honor to have such a strong professional to work with.
Likewise, Susan. Thank you for having me.
So I'd like to, thanks for coming. And I'd like to make sure that people know how to get in touch with you, what you're doing, what you're offering, and I'll say the same.
Sure.
Why don't you start?
Okay. Well, I'm Chandler Hoffman. You can always look me up on Google. I have a company that's called Amity Consulting. So it's www.amityconsulting.com. I have a website that you can review my, sort of do your own due diligence. And I do co-parenting and mediation and do collaborative divorce. And I am a PC on certain cases. I still do individual counseling and therapy with people. I do some couples work that I really appreciate, knowing sort of the other side of divorce and separation. I really sort of have a passion for helping certain couples, really, even if they're in contemplation, doing that kind of work. I see children, and I'm just very passionate about the work. So I get up every day thinking that there's some way in which I can help people redefine their relationship and better their communication and really take care of their children. And I think that's why I do my work specifically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And I would just echo that too, is that I think when I started doing this work with helping families separate, I was doing a lot of work with kids, and it was the only way that I could really help kids was to help the people that were raising them. figure out how to live more harmonious lives so that they could. So you'll find me also on my website. All the links for Chandler and my websites will be below in this talk. And you can contact me about my groups. You can get on my newsletter. And I'm offering a lot of online courses in 2020. So if you're on my newsletter, you'll get those announcements. But thank you so much for your information and all that you shared. Thanks again, Chandler. It was really great to talk to you today.
Nice to talk to you too, Susan. Thank you.
Okay, well, bye for now.
Bye.